So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mona Harib. I'm a professor of urban studies at politics at the American University of Beirut and one of the co-founders of the Beirut Urban Lab. It gives me a great pleasure to moderate this session, this webinar that is co-organized by the Arab Political Science Network and that is entitled the Urban Politics in the Arab Region. So I want to thank Ahmed Mursi for taking the initiative and entrusting me with organizing this event. This is a topic that's very dear to my heart. If you don't know BUL and the APSN, I think you're going to receive links to their website, and I highly recommend you check out APSN, which is a collaborative scholarly initiative that seeks to support Arab political scientists through many valuable opportunities. If you don't know it already, it's a great opportunity to discover this network. The Beirut Urban Lab, which I co-direct, is an interdisciplinary and collaborative research space that produces scholarship on urbanization, on urban transformations in Beirut and Lebanon more broadly, and is very interested in comparative scholarship in the Global South, hence this topic today as well. So APSN and BUL are quite aligned on believing that studying matters of power, politics, and cities and their intersections matters to scholarship and interdisciplinary scholarships particularly. There are more and more scholars with very different interdisciplinary background that are interested in these questions and these approaches to cities and politics, cities and power, the built environment and power, the natural environment and power networks. And this makes a lot of sense when we think about all the dramatic changes that are affecting cities, regions, and natural environments around cities in the Arab context and region. There are a lot of similarities between the cities in the Arab region, but we also have a lot of dissimilarities related to domestic politics, neoliberal economic pressures and compositions, as well as acute inequalities that differ from place to place and that get embedded in the context very differently. Also in relation to variations in violence and conflict and civil strife, and in aggravating environmental conditions that are profoundly transforming the built and natural environments in the Arab region. So we've invited three wonderful scholars to discuss their research around these questions and to reflect collectively on these changing dynamics and configurations of power in the cities in the Arab region, and also to reflect on issues related to contestation, representation, and appropriation of urban space, among other matters that we will discuss in this hour we have together. I'm really happy to introduce them this afternoon. Sarah Al-Azzaz is a senior lecturer in comparative politics of the Middle East at SOAS, University of London. She works on comparative political economy and urbanism in the Global South with a focus on infrastructure, the politics of science and technology, and ethnography. She has an upcoming book with Duke University Press that we're all eagerly waiting for. I think it's coming out very soon, entitled Building Politics, Urban Transformation and Making of Markets in Cairo and Istanbul. She is now working on another book investigating the politics of digital infrastructures by tracing the physical materialization of cloud technologies across the Global South with a focus on South Africa and Bahrain. Rafif Ziadeh is a lecturer in politics and public policy in the Department of International Development at King's College London. Her research centers on three thematic areas: infrastructures and logistics, gender and feminism, race and racialization, and her most recent scholarship is broadly concerned with the political economy of maritime infrastructures and logistics, with a focus on the Middle East and East Africa. She is currently involved in examining the impact of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, military and commercial interventions following the 2011 Arab uprisings, also a very exciting endeavor that we look forward to hearing more about. You may also know Rafif from her fabulous work as a researcher and campaign organizer with a number of refugee rights and anti-poverty NGOs. Omar Sirri is an Iraq researcher for Human Rights Watch and an affiliated researcher at the University of Toronto. AUB and the Lebanese scholars were lucky to have him for a few years while he was at the Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs as an affiliate scholar. He has been working on Iraq for more than a decade, exploring the socio-spatial transformation in contemporary Baghdad, and you may have read his wonderful paper in the LSE Working Papers, one of the series. His PhD in political science provides a fascinating ethnography of urban checkpoints practices in Baghdad and many other stories related to these checkpoints. It's always embedded under the big title of checkpoints, but I also know that it's a lot of many intersecting stories that we'll hear about later on today and his more recent interests. Okay, so a few words on how we're going to organize this webinar. I'm going to be asking 3 rounds of questions to the speakers, following which we will take questions from the audience. I'm going to ask everybody who's interested in raising a question or making a comment to please post them in the Q&A rather than in the chat where they can get unseen there. We can miss them if you do that there. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Again, I note that this webinar is being recorded and streamed and will be uploaded on the YouTube channel of the APSN. So without further ado, I thank you all for attending. I'm happy to see that we have several people in the audience, and I look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A. Don't hesitate to share your thoughts with us. And I'm going to start the seminar with the first question. We're going to go in the following order. We'll hear from Sarah first, Rafif, Sarah, Omar, and then Rafif. And we're going to ask our speakers to please briefly present themselves and position their work in relation to the field of urban politics, how they understand it, how they relate to it, and tell us why they think investigating questions that relate to the city and the built environment matter to the studies of power and politics more broadly, or vice versa, depending on where you want to enter from. So, Sarah, tfaddali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Ahmed and the APSN network for this invitation and the Beirut Urban Lab. Really excited to be here amongst some of my favorite scholars in this field. So it feels like quite a privilege. All right, so Mona's already kind of given you a sense of the 2 projects that kind of how I've put a lot of work and time into recently. I guess I'll just maybe talk a little bit more about what the book has been doing. So basically, as Mona said, it's forthcoming with Duke sometime, hopefully spring, summer of 2023. And the idea there was to examine the politics of neoliberalism through the lens of a multi-sited ethnography in 6 neighborhoods undergoing transformation in Cairo and Istanbul. And it mostly focuses on projects that were ongoing in the 2000s. And the main kind of, speaking of positioning the work, the main idea here is to open up how we talk about political economy, how we think about market making, how we think about the intersections of the making of markets, but also the politics of expertise, science. Mona mentioned that I kind of trained in science and technology studies as well. So this is pretty important for me to kind of put these things together and think about how it transforms our experience of the political, really, at the end of the day. And when Mona asked sort of, how do we why is it important to look at this through, look at the power and politics through the lens of the city? For me, there's no kind of, it just seems so obvious, and there's kind of no other way to do it. No, I mean, definitely other ways. But I mean, basically, I read A.L. Wiseman's book as a master's student when it was still kind of the work on politics of verticality. And here I'm dating myself a little bit. And it's just, you know, you see the dynamics of how he talks about how kind of infrastructural projects come together, how the making of the urban built environment produces settler colonial dynamics that are impossible to unsee, right? The minute you kind of see how these built environmental transformations are shaping the political in very powerful ways, no matter how much my graduate training tried to shake it off of me, it was impossible. And then kind of my pathway to really kind of giving the space to the spatial, material, and affective experiences of the city as kind of the core of where I see the production of the political economic and the political or the polity as we kind of know it. And the second book kind of takes similar interests, but moves in a slightly different direction. And so rather than centering on the city as a space where I'm going to see these spatial, material, affective experiences, I decided to follow digital infrastructures across the global south, and especially the cloud, as it kind of transforms the world as we know it, how we see it, how we perceived it, but also the geographies of connection of the political in across and I'm focusing on the Middle East and Africa, and the interesting thing and the kind of challenge here for me methodologically is I'm really interested in looking at connection here, right? My first project was very much a place-based project, 6 neighborhoods in which I was very much embedded during the ethnography, and now to follow kind of a particular object that is the cloud and the political that is forming around it, but also maintain an ethnographic sensibility is kind of what I'm hoping to achieve, but also finding an interesting challenge. So I'll leave it here as an introduction into the kind of work that I'm doing, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Sarah. Fascinating. We want to know so much more, but I'm going to defer to Omar to build on this or to depart from this, depending how he'd like to do it. Tfaddal, Omar.
Thank you, Mona, very much. And thank you to the APSN for this generous invitation. It is pretty humbling to be in conversation with Mona, Sarah, and Rafif today, whose work I continue to learn from. So my research over the last few years has centered around 3 themes or areas: securitization, the city, and the state. My book project, which grew out of my doctoral dissertation, is an ethnography of security checkpoints in contemporary Baghdad. Checkpoints became ubiquitous in Baghdad in the wake of the US and UK-led invasion and occupation of Iraq nearly 2 decades ago. They were set up and operated by the US military, and their control was slowly transitioned to Iraqi authorities and security institutions, primarily Baghdad Operations Command, an institution that was established in late 2006. And while most of the many checkpoints have slowly been removed over the last few years, many do still remain. What led me to the checkpoint as a kind of focus of research was not so much traditional questions about civil war and political violence, such as how and why civil wars begin, or when and why people switch allegiances during such events, which have been, a key kind of focus of political science literature. Rather, the checkpoint becomes my object of study in large part because of how they are lived. Despite hundreds of checkpoints kind of pockmarking Baghdad's streetscapes, most of the city's residents have lamented them as wholly incapable of providing urban security. They point to both spectacular and mundane forms of insecurity and violence as proof of their, quote unquote, ineffectiveness. So part of what I argue is even while struggling to produce security across the capital city, these checkpoints remain integral to helping produce state authority, or the state kind of as we know it. And so I guess two kind of direct answers to this first question. First, in my work, the city and the people and things that help comprise it become an entry point in determining the ways in which political authority comes to be, even when it lets us down over and over again. How and why does it still form under such conditions? And second, as much as I look at a specific security architecture, the checkpoint, in a discrete city, Baghdad, investigating urban space and materials helps us see the limits of delimits. That is, the need to push back on the idea that the checkpoint and the city are circumscribed sites and spaces. In this way, I move away from thinking topographically, such as by deploying scale as a unit of analysis. I instead try to explore conditions more relationally or topologically, to explore how a range of social forces inside and outside a city ultimately work across spaces and geographies. In other words, spatial entanglements produce and are produced by modes of governance that are not so much bounded by lines on a map, but instead sometimes form through the blurredness of those lines or their altogether erasure. And I'll leave it there for now. I want to thank you.
That's very inspiring. Thank you, Ahmad. Very insightful. Rafif, your turn.
Thank you very much, Muna. And of course, thanks to the APSN and to the Beirut Urban Lab for putting us all in conversation. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with Omar, Sarah, and Muna. My work has largely focused on the politics of transport infrastructures and logistics chains. So I look at things like maritime ports, roads, rail, airports, and logistics cities as they are transforming the economic geography of the MENA region more broadly. Although there's an increasing interest in looking at infrastructures, what some have even called the infrastructural turn, I would say this work is much more advanced in the field of geography and anthropology than it has been in politics. And what I'm really hoping to do is push this further in centering infrastructures and how we can understand the political, the built environment, and how logistics is reshaping the connections within the Middle East region, but also trans-regionally with other regions. My main focus has been on the Gulf Cooperation Council, tracing what the United Arab Emirates has been doing in expanding its logistics space, both nationally, regionally, and transnationally. Much of this work was inspired by Ahmed Qana's now classic City as Corporation. I think many of us are building on that work of looking at the city as corporation, but seeing how it functions in different spheres. There has also been interesting work in political economy, trying to push beyond the rentier state theory. For a very long time, when it came to understanding the Gulf Cooperation Council, rentier state theory was the only prism by which we understood it. There was only a focus on oil. Some have even said a fetishism of oil. And I think there's been a new generation of research that has really pushed against that in trying to understand the GCC beyond only oil and to look at these logistics change and how they are reshaping space. Within infrastructure studies, there is a big focus on black boxing, the idea that we normally don't understand how infrastructures work, except for when they fail. And when you look at waves of contestation in the Middle East recently, many of them have actually been around infrastructural failure, whether it's electricity, access to water, etc. So I think in trying to understand the political, centering infrastructures, who has access to them, how they function within a city is really crucially important. Maritime infrastructure in particular, I think is playing a significant role nowadays in international relations. If we think about what some have called the infrastructural scramble going on, especially for infrastructure within the African continent, here thinking about networks like the One Belt, One Road, or the United Arab Emirates investing extensively in maritime ports across the Horn of Africa, we see how these infrastructures are reshaping international relations and reshaping connections between states. But importantly, they're also reshaping cities. Cities are being remade in the interest of trade, market-led development, rather for the interest of the residents who live within them. So one of the things I try to trace is these new infrastructures and even entirely new cities that are being made for the purpose of logistics. One of the innovations in Dubai, for example, has been something called the Logistics City, which is a city entirely made for the purpose of logistics that sits alongside a port. A lot of these experiments in this type of logistics are actually happening within our region, and I think deserve a lot deeper study. Two of the things I focus on when I look at this is the increasing intersection between these infrastructures of trade, aid, and militarism. Some of these infrastructures are for trade on face value, but many of them actually cohered around the war on Iraq, with the logistics chains that happened at that time, needing these big maritime ports for the US military in the region. So there is a major overlap in the infrastructures of trade and militarism. More recently, because our region is having one of the largest so-called humanitarian disasters, one of the largest phases of displacement since World War II, humanitarianism also plays a large role. So we are seeing an intersection between these infrastructures of trade and infrastructures of humanitarianism. So alongside Dubai Logistics City, we also have something called Dubai Humanitarian City, which I can speak about extensively later. So there is a tracing here to be done and a mapping around the intersections of trade, aid, and militarism. One question I'm particularly interested in is the question of labor. The labor of constructing these so-called cities, the labor of building these ports. Where is it coming from? How is it being treated? And here, again, we see an intersection with militarism. It's largely the same chains that were used to bring logistical labor for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that are being used to create these hubs and these new networks of logistics. So that's in a nutshell what I try to look at.
Fascinating. The word infrastructure is very productive for the three of you in very different ways. I find this quite interesting how it's taking that turn. Okay, we're going to go to the second core question because I want to hear more of you, although I'm holding back from commenting and asking more specific questions on what you said. We'll do that a bit later if we, depending on the time issues. So the second set of questions actually asks you to dive a bit deeper into your research by maybe giving us 2 or 3 stories about how did you your study explored cities as sites of contestation. We know that there are a lot, you mentioned many of those, there are a lot of actors, institutions, systems, infrastructures that come into place and that seek to govern the city, often to capture it and redistribute trends and to advance power interests. We heard this in different ways through your introductions. We also heard about how dwellers and also workers have to navigate these configurations of power to access services and livelihoods, some trying to benefit from the rent capture that exists at higher scales, or to benefit from some form of social capital, while I think a big majority merely struggles to survive day to day and even half day to half day with the aggravating conditions of inequality. My question to you is how your work illustrates these shifting configurations of power and their dynamics in these contexts of aggravated inequalities, crisis, and violence that you each mentioned in their own context of study. So I will give the floor to maybe Rafif to continue building on what she started with, and so we stay with your framework, and then we move to Omar and then Sarah, perhaps.
Great, thank you. So one thing I want to pick up on is the idea of crisis itself, because I think nowadays we're using the word crisis very often. I live in the UK and everything is a crisis constantly. So I wanted to pick up on the idea of crisis itself, of crises being moments that are extremely malleable, where things can go in any direction. They ultimately represent malleability, fluidity, and they are frequently seized upon as moments for capitalist states and powerful actors as opportunities to restructure. This includes restructuring the urban environment and to push forward change in ways that were previously foreclosed. So since the 2011 uprisings, there has been this idea of within, at least a motif within international financial institutions, that there is the crisis in the region, the crisis of the model that has existed, is an opportunity. But they see it as an opportunity to push forward even more market solutions. The World Bank and the IMF have very clearly said that the problem was there wasn't enough market in the Middle East, and if we could push more market solutions, that will be the best outcome that can happen. This includes further integration of the region into international trade and logistics chains. So we are speaking about the usual export-oriented model of development, but here it centers around what has been called infrastructure-led growth, that the best way for the crisis to be resolved is to put more money and more investments into trade infrastructures, be it maritime ports, be it airports, basically extractivist infrastructures that would make extractivism easier and to flow a lot. So you will see a lot of projects across the region that are particularly trade infrastructures. There hasn't been a lot of work that actually triangulates how these are working together. So one of the areas I've been looking at is around food. And I think if we're going to study the city, one of the key questions to ask is, where is our food coming from? How is food being structured? One dynamic happening around the region is that food and logistical chains are intersecting in such a way that the majority of the food is for export-oriented. So export-oriented production. Already on a regional scale, much of the food is imported to our region, and we see when something like Ukraine happens, it impacts the region very strongly. When we then orient the economies fully for trade and for these food infrastructures to go for export, it really changes how we live the city and how we access our food, our daily incomes. So to me, the question of food regimes and how it's intersecting with these infrastructures is really important. A lot of silos are being constructed around wheat farms, for example, that then connect directly to new train investments that are being linked directly to ports. So the question of food security has been criticized, and the concept of food security has been largely criticized. We are yet to see a lot of studies around how food and logistics are intersecting on a regional scale. Another area that I think is really interesting, again, is this question of humanitarianism and logistics. And here, I think the story of Dubai Humanitarian City is a very good one around how an opportunity, destruction on one side is actually opportunity on another side of the region. So Dubai International Humanitarian City allows for the United Arab Emirates in particular to position itself as a stable location within the region that can use its logistical network in order to supply logistical humanitarian support. Dubai International Humanitarian City is actually the hub of humanitarian logistics within the entire region, yet hardly any of us hear about it. Most of us don't know how it functions, although the majority of the big United Nations agencies are actually stationing all of their logistical supplies there. So back to this idea of crisis as opportunity, in this case, the displacement crisis that we have in the region was actually utilized by states like the United Arab Emirates as an opportunity to sell themselves, while at the same time really sealing the country from accepting refugees or accepting a large refugee population. And one last thing I will say is, again, an area that I think we all need to be investigating a lot more is this concept of smart cities and the transition towards smart cities that we are seeing very aggressively. Because I look at the United Arab Emirates, you really see this extreme push towards smart technologies, smart cities that are also intersecting with climate action, with green technologies. And here there's many questions around surveillance, how it's being structured and how it's working through these smart city technologies. Particularly if we look politically at moves toward normalization with Israel, looking at the United Arab Emirates and normalization with Israel, we see how these surveillance technologies are circulating on a regional scale. So I think there's certainly room to dig a lot more deeply into smart cities and how they are impacting the region as a whole, and how these technologies are being perpetuated to increase surveillance at the same time under the guise of being also climate smart technologies.
Yes, greenwashing narratives in action. Thank you, Rafid. Omar, would you like to share with us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, on the question, not on Rafid's work, which would require a completely separate presentation, which is all fascinating and super important, especially on this notion of crisis, which we should talk more about. So to the question, so I'll try and give I guess a two-part answer, or kind of two distinct things to talk about to this question that I think speak to the complexity inherent to what I think the question called configurations of power, at least in Baghdad. First, during part of my research into checkpoints in Baghdad, I was able to carry out in situ observation at two different checkpoints, one operated by federal police in the Karada district in eastern Baghdad, or just east of the Tigris River, and a second operated by Iraqi soldiers in the Mansour district in western Baghdad. One of the conditions or practices immediately apparent to me during this research, which will come as no real surprise, I think, to the city's residents, are the ways in which these installations are classed. The vehicles most often stopped for secondary inspection as they were passing through were occupied by lower income residents of the city, usually identifiable by the model and condition, the model of the kind of the vehicle, the condition of the vehicle that they were driving or riding in. These checkpoints, once numbering some 1,500 across the city at their height, were central to an urban counterinsurgency strategy introduced by the US, of course, and kind of taken over by the Iraqis, a socio-material tactic on which authorities and security commanders incessantly doubled down on for the better part of 2 decades. But as Ahmed, a police officer at the checkpoint in Karada, would often say to me during my research, during this time at the checkpoint, checkpoints only hurt the poor. He would always say to me, checkpoints only hurt the poor. While lower income residents were persistently held up at these checkpoints, members of parastatal armed groups, once known as militias, were always given free pass through these checkpoints. Implicated in some of the most vicious violence perpetrated across Baghdad in the mid-2000s, only a few short years later, members of these groups began driving through the city, carrying with them letterhead embossed with their respective group's logo, and on which is written neatly typed vehicle information, along with the name of the driver to whom it is registered. The idea being here, they show the letter, and if they're even stopped, usually driving white SUVs with tinted windows, and if they are stopped, they show the letter to allow for laissez-passer. Somewhat separate here. Second, in the spring of 2019, security authorities abruptly shut the real estate registration department for the Mansour district of Baghdad. In Samiha, Tapo Mansour. The department maintains land deeds and property titles. When a property owner sells their land or their home, the sale is registered with the Tapo. all of these, all the information of who owns what land in this district is registered with the office. For years, Iraqis, for many, many years, Baghdad's residents, Iraqis in Baghdad and elsewhere, but we're talking about the capital, especially those who left the country during the worst of the city's post-2003 violence, have reported property thefts to authorities. This appropriation of people's homes and land occurs legally. That is, victims of this practice, which we can get into, essentially discover that the deeds and titles of their properties are no longer in their name. They no longer own their property. When they inspect and investigate how and why these the property titles are no longer, the property is no longer there, as registered in the TAPO, the one-time owners discover that forged documents, including personal identification, sometimes even their fingerprints, were used to essentially process the theft. Members of Baghdad's Christian community, many who fled the city because of identitarian violence, again in the mid to late 2000s, have been particularly affected by this practice. And there's an important piece in Deraj, for those of you who follow their fantastic news site, they wrote a very long, exhaustive piece on this issue as it affected Christians, which you can check out. But the appropriative practice, what I would call an appropriative practice, actually crosses sectarian lines. And in Mansour, where the authorities closed the office in 2019, is, after all, home to a sizable Sunni community. Of course, we push back against these terminologies, for the record, these kind of very crude notions of identity in Baghdad. They've been rather destructive in the city and across the country, just kind of even speaking them into existence. But at the same time, when we speak of them, I think we need to reflect how these conversations even play out in everyday life. And this is kind of a fact that we have to think through, and harkens me to this new volume by Stanford University Press that's just come out called Practicing Sectarianism, which is focusing on Lebanon, but we talk about how that really addresses how we talk about how we deal with this issue of sectarianism, I think in a far more nuanced way than we've seen in the past. So just back to the story, a senior bureaucrat in Baghdad with knowledge of the events surrounding the closure of this office in Mansour told me at the time that in effect what occurred was an unrelated security operation, a raid on a home in a different part of the city, very, very far away from Mansour, led to the discovery of essentially a land theft ring in Mansour. What other pieces have since called land mafias. What he said to me at the time was the home, this is a kind of quote, the home was strewn with documents from Tapo Mansour, he told me, adding, it was clear that the officials running the Tapo were in on the whole thing, working on the instruction of or in tandem with an influential armed group. Living with checkpoints and living with legalized land theft, essentially, may sound like distinct phenomena. And the takeaway here is not merely that both issues speak to conditions of everyday security and insecurity, kind of broadly defined. I think perhaps a bigger point or bigger takeaway rests with predictability. The presence and relative power of these actors, security personnel performing the state in the streets, parastatal armed groups, once known as militias, simultaneously embedded in the capillaries of state authority, while quite literally slipping through its grasp. These realities, far from any ideal political order, have become predictable to those who live with it. Perhaps predictability being another measure of people's steadfastness or resilience, term I think is rather tired. At the same time, predictability does not preclude uncertainty. They are, in Baghdad at least, rather entangled. The predictable configurations of power in Iraq's capital city today do not so much demand some sort of anticipation of further physical violence for what's been called for wars yet to come, the context of Beirut. But they do suggest other forms of everyday social and economic violence that persist and perpetuate a lived uncertainty that I suspect is just as intolerable as any other form of violence. Thanks, Mona.
Thank you, Omar. I will refrain from commenting because it's so interesting to see what's happening at the micro level of how people are receiving these production of spatialities that Rafif mentioned and how they're living them through what you're describing, and that huge violence, actually you were just talking about it, that is experienced from the exclusivity of producing space for certain networks of people that do not live in these cities, actually, for most of the time. Sarah, take us to other terrains and let's see how to enrich this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you both. Wow, so much to think about and to think with. I guess I guess I'll kind of focus in on where this project, what inspired it, and where is sort of what brought me to the study of the political in the first place, which is inequality, right? I was, living in Cairo, kind of seeing kind of a very just mind-blowing kind of inequality, and just, being in the city, and really kind of the brunt of neoliberalism in the mid-2000s. And from that kind of started graduate work in a political science department, really interested in these questions. And as I was interested in political economy, I also got fascinated with urban studies and what urban studies was doing, and felt like there might be something really interesting to see, or kind of how these questions merge. But I had several found several ways in which the different worlds didn't speak to each other, and kind of felt like there were really serious gaps in how we were conceptualizing inequality, conceptualizing these lived struggles. And the main ones were that as I looked at questions of political economy, it seemed to me that most of that field, not all of it, and I'll talk about the exceptions, were really kind of, as they were looking at neoliberalism, were really most interested in going to familiar sites of redistributive politics, the sites of thinking about subsidies, thinking about subsidies is huge for Middle East studies, but mass housing, when you're interested in the city, rent control, things like that, which all are still really important to me as I look at these questions, but felt like they gave you circumscribed answers to what's happening under neoliberalism. And then when I looked at the study of the city, I felt like, and especially within the realm of the political, we were focusing quite a bit about sort of looking at the urban as a space of lived contestation, of lived struggle, of in the Middle East, the survival under authoritarianism kind of became really the rubric through which we were seeing the city, especially at the turn of the millennium. And that also felt a little bit like a little frustrating, because it felt like there were so many layers to the city that were not seen through this lens. And even as the built environment was important in that world, it felt like kind of there was a way in which we were really kind of focused on a language of informality and so on, that left so much space to think with. And especially as a student of the politics of expertise and science and technology studies, and I look at the architectural historians and what they were doing, look at all of that, I felt like there was a lot missing in how we were kind of bringing together experiences, but also the making of urban spaces in a political economic context. And then finally, the frustration with what I felt like a really interesting world of writing about neoliberalism through cities, but that took for granted kind of almost a defeat of a redistributive politics. And I wanted to sit and say, how did we get here? How did we decide that this is an entirely dispossessive project, and that there is kind of no negotiation of that in a neoliberal moment? And other than contestation on the margins. And I wanted to see if we could talk about contestation from within the project that I felt was really missing in that conversation. And that brought me, and these gaps, these holes really start to open up to me through many stages of the writing of this book. They don't come to me all together. I wish it was that magical and kind of straightforward, or maybe that wouldn't be quite as fun. But kind of, and through my work, I came to kind of look at ways that we can sort of bring different worlds together to address these gaps, address these questions a little bit differently. And here comes kind of where the book is intervening. And I'll use a very short anecdote vignette, ethnographic vignette, to kind of give you a sense of how I built my, the intervention. I know I don't have enough time to be reading or anything, so I'll kind of just jump right into it. So basically, my ethnography was looking at how architects and urban planners were transforming spaces in central neighborhoods and central districts in Istanbul and Cairo. And one of the projects I looked at was the Al Khan Foundation's project in Darb al-Ahmar in Cairo. And it was so interesting to me to see, we're looking at a project that is very much working with affordable housing, and you have almost sort of the project itself is not meant to be creating displacement, but we'll be talking about that a little bit. And so you have a lot of the same residents kind of staying through and seeing their homes being restored by the Al Khan Foundation. And so what I was interested in is what is how are these homes actually restored? And as I was studying that, I realized that in several buildings, as I was talking to residents, I realized that they were having to share water pipes and water pumps. And it was really interesting because you had to coordinate with your neighbors about when you were using the water pump. And these are buildings that are just restored by the Al Khan Foundation. And so I asked these residents, is this how it always was? And they said, no, actually the Al Khan Foundation introduced these shared pumps, whereas in the past, we each had kind of control over our water in different ways. And I found that interesting, right? Because a lot of people were really thankful about the restorations, especially that they came through big grants, but were confused why, they were creating some of these things that seemed logistically more difficult. And so I asked the planner, right, what's the deal with these water pumps? And here is his quote. Quote, our purpose was that you learn to coordinate with your neighbors. So for example, when we installed water pumps, we would find that in a building with 6 residents, each of the residents wants to install their own. We would refuse such requests because if they can't resolve issues around using a water pump, then there's no sense in them restoring the house altogether. In other words, they have to talk to each other, end quote. Now, this was pretty interesting because I was expecting a very logistical answer, right? Like I'm going in, the architect is going to tell me there's no room for the water pumps or something like that, right? And and I got a political one, and I'm like, wow, all right, bring it on, man. So this was all about, building community in a way, right? So that really made me sit and think about the fact that what we're seeing here, and we see this over and over again in the book, is a project of social engineering through building design, right? And in a negotiation of the social engineering, because the residents are very active in the making of these spaces, that occurs. And that kind of brings me to, at first when I was writing the dissertation, I really focused in on the social engineering, but it was time, with time, I started to see it as part of a much larger market making project. And that's really kind of where the intervention sits, which is to argue that, as we're looking at things like the design of water pumps, it opens up seeing the political economy of neoliberalism in unfamiliar sites, right? What I'm interested in is what happens when you go to the spaces outside of kind of legislative spaces, or or executive order spaces, or wherever that the kind of we think redistributive policies are being made, and look at places like urban design. And instead, I'm kind of finding that this careful urban design is meant to actually manipulate real estate markets and property markets and battles for housing in Istanbul and Cairo, through things like the production of community, the preservation of heritage, mitigating disaster risk, right? And using all of those modalities, not just as revenue generators, as we've talked about for so long in urban studies, but as a place for intervening in a battle over housing. So both, protagonists who are interested in protecting affordable housing on the one hand, and protagonists interested in kind of cornering real estate markets for very heavy kind of capitalist accumulation, are going to the subtle design of the building. Not corruption on the one hand, not rent control, fighting for rent control on the other, to intervene in these struggles. And it's really kind of looking at the mechanisms through which they're producing what I call particularistic value for different neighborhoods that transforms how these real estate markets work altogether. And the idea here is that when we kind of see methodologically, right, bottom up, how the built environment and kind of social engineering, but politics around it is being transformed, allows us to see the market differently. And that actually there's a lot of contestation, a lot of political projects happening from within what we think of as market logics, and not just on the margins. And that's kind of where the intervention was going. But also the intervention takes us to the world of how do we think of where the political struggles are actually playing out in a neoliberal moment. And you see that so many struggles around identity politics and corruption and so on are playing out around the design of someone's balcony, someone's bathroom, right? Whether or not property deeds are being kind of rumors around whether property deeds are going to kind of bring back expelled populations from different cities, like especially minorities from Istanbul, for example. All of these dynamics produce kind of a repoliticization of all of that urban design that seem to really subtly kind of manipulate the market. And so again, produces a really interesting way of seeing that the political is actually being displaced onto these, the burden of these political struggles being displaced onto these kind of minute crevices of the city, and are really difficult to recuperate then as a polity, right, in a public forum. So it then kind of stumbled on, well, should we be talking here about how we think about neoliberalism and populism or conspiracy theory, as a lot of the spaces that we used to kind of have for recuperating these political struggles are being displaced in other spaces. Anyway, so that's kind of where this project was going. I'll stop there about the book, and just to make a couple of notes in relation to what some of Rafif and Omar were saying. As I was thinking about the second project and what Rafif was saying about smart cities, there's so much to think about here, and just kind of, just starting out this project, I'm finding something really interesting about, maybe just a plea for all of us to start to think about how our perspective around using things like IoT, Internet of Things, and smart cities and so on, is not just about kind of the collection of data, as and really important dynamics of surveillance and so on, but also just how we're going to see the world in terms of aggregating the how these data is being aggregated and how it's being manipulated. And I think a really interesting intervention here is Louise Amour's book on cloud ethics, which really pushes us to think about, let's move beyond the privacy issues and think about that perspective change. So I wanted to kind of plug that in there. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to the three of you. We're, of course, pressed by time. We were asked to try to finish in 1 hour. This is mission impossible, so we're going to take 15 more minutes. For those of you who are still with us, we'll stop at 5:15 or whatever that hour is, depending on where you're signing off from. So I invite you to start posting your questions in the Q&A box. You already have one that we'll go back to. We won't have time to go through the third round of question in the same detail that we wanted to, but I'm going to give back the floor to the three of you if you have any additional comments or issues you'd like to raise very quickly, please. 1 minute to each one of you, just to do that. I'd like to say a few words as well, and then we'll open it up so it gives enough time for you and the audience to try to formulate your questions or your comments. So let me start with Omar. Omar, would you like to add anything? You're still on mute.
Classic Zoom move. I'll try and give a 45 seconds, and I might even then bleed into the answer to a question that was asked. I just noticed directed to me, if that's okay. So yeah, I won't read this. I'll just kind of riff off of what I have here, which is that 3 years ago today, protests resumed in Baghdad in October 2019. They began on the 1st of October, continued for 8 days, paused, and then resumed 3 years ago today, 25 of October. And as we're meeting today, there are protesters now back in the streets commemorating the 3rd-year anniversary of the Tishreen protest movement, and are being kind of faced by state security personnel in Baghdad. And 3 years ago, these protesters were met with vicious violence. Upwards of 500 protesters were killed in the first few weeks of the uprising, and then were followed by a kind of essentially a targeted assassination campaign carried out by parastatal groups over the course of 2020 and 2021. The government, in the face of those, it should be noted, in the face of those protests, for the first time in modern Iraqi history, the government was felled by a popular uprising. So it resigned on the 29th of November. The government of Adil Abdul Mahdi, one of the, as I call them, the OGs of the Iraqi diasporic elite, who kind of rolled into Baghdad in 2003 and long sought the premiership for many years, and achieved that goal before it was cut short after a year of his government. Two months ago, there was another protest movement, or another set of protests that occurred in Baghdad, very different, with a different hue, which were the protesters were supporters of Muqtada, who were expressing their discontent and dissatisfaction with a political protest, a political stalemate that had lasted almost a year by that point, and lasted over a year since the elections that were held in 2021, early elections that were brought about, for the record, by the protest movement, that occurred because of the protesters' demands. Expressing dissatisfaction with the process that had occurred, they took to the streets and were essentially allowed and permitted to occupy the green zone. So the protesters 3 years ago were shot at and killed, and the protesters 2 months ago occupied the green zone, including the Iraqi parliament. the point here is, I offer this kind of comparison because it begins to answer this question of political struggle and who gets to protest and who gets to occupy the city, when and why, right? And this brings me to the question that was asked about who has control. So, are these militias, as you call them, parastatal armed groups, however you want to define them, trying to or push back against the state? And I think the answer, the kind of blunt answer, is probably not. And the more complicated answer is, to what extent state authority is useful for parastatal armed groups, and when is it not? When isn't it? So when you're, passing through a checkpoint, you were on some level kind of reifying the authority that's there, offering your own kind of legitimate, offering it legitimacy by simply passing through and not physically violently challenging it. Or in the case of the Mansour appropriation of land, they're quite literally using state authority to, and embedding themselves and their interests within that state authority, using it to then gain financial benefit. So to say that they're kind of, standing against the state or pushing back for their own authority, I think it's far more complicated. And I think it would cause huge problems for them, frankly, for these groups, if they were to kind of take on the state head on. Why not appropriate it for your own financial gain? Use the system to your advantage. And that's on some level why protesters who essentially are supporting an existing political party and movement that has an incredible amount of power and street power, frankly, the Sadrist movement, are kind of permitted to roll in and occupy segments of the green zone and the Iraqi parliament, not simply because the state and state security personnel are trying to prevent violent conflict, but in fact, these protesters and those who they represent are not calling for the downfall of the system, or a political order that was never meant to represent popular interests, right? The protesters who were shot at and killed 3 years ago were doing exactly that. They were calling for a complete, overhaul of the system that has offered them nothing for the last 2 decades. And so this begins to answer this question of, are they pushing against the state? I don't think so at all. I think you create huge problems, very uncomfortable problems, when you're calling for, pushing back against the system, which you're like wholesale benefiting from. And I think that kind of, when we start to think about the question in different terms, how and why do these, groups operate in these ways? And what are they seeking to do, and how are they seeking to benefit? It opens up a whole set of different kinds of questions about how the city and these spaces are actually lived, and the extent to which, and the effects that are created by their actions for people's everyday lives.
Thank you, Omar. I'm really glad that you brought in the idea or the role of the state in the conversation. I wanted to mention that in the end, but let's go to Rafif.
Okay, just very briefly, the original
Yes.
question was about contestation. And I think questions of contestation around infrastructures, especially electricity and water, are going to continue to be crucial in the coming period, especially when faced with what Ruthie Gilmore has called the organized abandonment of the neoliberal state. Having said that, COVID-19 is still around. And there were incredible experiments of mutual aid and communities sticking together to survive the pandemic. Also, the pandemic hit the region when there were already large protests happening in several countries. The pandemic had an impact on them, but that contestation is still there because the core reasons for the uprisings has not been settled across the region. And here I just want to plug in the question of temporality and how we should think about protest. For the past 2 years, there were all these discussions around the anniversaries of the uprisings. Many in academia in the West basically declared them all failures. I think we should think of these waves of protests more in a Walter Benjamin kind of sense of different temporalities, and think of the protests as moments of ebbs and flow, and that the dynamics from one will lead into the other. They don't just disappear, and the lessons learned don't just disappear from the streets. And we will continue to see waves of them because the core issues around redistribution, around the city and how the city is organized and how things are redistributed have still not been resolved in any meaningful way across the region.
I lately say محكومون بالنضال مش بالأمل بالنضال. It's like the struggle cannot stop for people who are from this region. Sarah, last words before I conclude and we take questions from the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Amar and Rafif were saying in terms of protest, I think right on Rafif's last point, one thing to think about that's been really interesting is the effervescence of movements that really center, right, the environment, cities, and so on. And coming, studying a place like Istanbul in Turkey, where you have the Gezi Park protests in 2013, and what's really interesting to me there is how much just the kind of overwhelming organizational capacity that's built around these questions as they intersect with questions around growing authoritarianism and so on in the country, that remain quite strong in spite of the fact that there's a lot of clampdown on these movements as well. And actually brings me to a point that Rafif talked about in her, I think, her remarks quite a bit ago about crisis, right? And what's really interesting is to think about how agitation around particular crises. So, for example, the earthquakes in Turkey and how kind of a really strong movement had built up since the Marmara earthquakes all through the 2000s was hijacked quite in really interesting ways by the state to mobilize all sorts of laws that allow for the dispossession of spaces. So again, around disaster risk, right? So to think about, how do we link social movement to crisis, to that kind of accumulation logics is really interesting. But one example, because Mona had asked us to think about a movement that was really interesting, and one example that really jumped at me during my research was work in Istanbul around building cooperatives and property cooperatives. And that really, it was quite a large project that the idea there was to ensure that those living in informal housing or gece condos in Istanbul were organizing themselves into property cooperatives so that they saw their property as all linked rather than being able to be bought one by one through kind of deals with the state that would then enable dispossession of entire and kind of displacement of entire areas. And the way it was done was quite inspiring because it really was one of the movements that felt like it really understood the core problems that we're dealing with from a political economic perspective and went straight at the heart of that. And I really appreciated that, but also appreciated the kinds of networks that came together around students from architecture schools, around lawyers, around and so on and so forth to build this movement. And so, that was one example that really kind of I thought was really interesting. Stop there for now.
Thank you so much. I think, we managed to demonstrate how rich the field of urban politics is. We are unable to just explore it all in one webinar, and it's really an invitation to address more this issue through more roundtables, more meetings, more explorations, especially from a comparative lens. I think we can, there are so many intersections we can think of in these conversations. I would just like to say a concluding comment before giving you back the floor to answer the questions that are posted in the Q&A. If you can start looking at them, maybe we can just informally take them up. What I found really interesting is, when we talk about neoliberalism and the retreat of the state and how the state's role today is about enabling markets, etc. We often forget that the state is also very much still here. And I think each one of you has shown in what ways the state still performs and has a very strong presence. We heard it through the examples of checkpoints and repressive violence in the case of Baghdad. We know about repression and authoritarianism in context of Egypt and even Turkey and GCC countries. If I want to bring in the Lebanese example, the same repression of the protest happened in Lebanon, very much similarly to what happened in Baghdad as well. So I find that there's this oppressive, repressive state that we still find very strongly through the police and securitization and surveillance, which is also very much funded by aid networks. And Rafif, you mentioned the role of that as well. But at the same time, there's also a role of the state in perpetuating the laissez-faire for a multitude of other actors to fill in and play a role of service provision, goods provision, filling the voids through intermediaries that the state benefit from as well, or its state network. And there's also the state as an extractive rent seeker, which uses its power and authority to gain both authority and, I would say, financial returns through rent. So I think that's an idea that came very strongly through all the stories you're telling, and where the state is not just, the bureaucrat or the public institution, but also the network of allies and that work with the state, including the urban planners and the designers and the architects who are somehow endorsed or enabled by state institutions to revitalize a neighborhood or to transform it through a partnership or providing a space for Aga Khan to work, or UN Habitat to work, or UNDP to work, or I'm thinking also of the Lebanese context, where now the recovery after the blast of the port of Beirut is all delegated to a network of NGOs, even faith-based organizations, and where the humanitarian aid agency, I think you have a question on that, Rafif, in the chat box, about that, where's Beirut versus Dubai with that humanitarian aid agency? But we could ask that question also vis-a-vis Baghdad. I learned recently that the same program that is coordinating the recovery of Beirut after the blast, called the 3RF, there's another 3RF in Iraq as well. So it's even the same nomenclature and the same protocols that are devised by these humanitarian groups. So there's a lot to interrogate. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing the complexities of your research. I hope it inspires the people who are there to look it up, to read it more. And I know I'm much more excited to do that and follow through your work. I'm really looking forward to further conversations. We have very little minutes to answer questions, so I'm going to ask you to please select from the Q&A the ones addressed to you. Omar, I think you have a couple, if you've seen them, from Tamara, on how the displaced Christian community attempted to reclaim their properties, who are the perpetrators of the legal theft, if you can take that up very quickly. And there's one for Rafif from Leila Drif, if you can check it. And I think we answered the rest. So Sarah, perhaps you can answer the one by Ahmad Jazouli.
I'll be quick. Thanks for the questions and the engagements. Thank you again, Muna, for this and organizing this and leading it. And the conversation must continue. Quickly, I think I answered Ahmad's question, or tried to. I hope I was somewhat successful. To Tamara's question, two quick answers. One, members of the Christian community have coincidentally actually met with a representative from Muqtada Sadr's office to reclaim homes that were appropriated. And latest reports from last year were that they were able to get back 120 homes that were once owned by members of the Christian community. And this kind of landed in a significant fanfare and press, and you can kind of look this up. Rather fascinating, in part because it speaks to one, the ways in which authority is formed, the kind of political authority and legitimacy of the authority of this figure and this movement in negotiating with members of the Christian community. And then I think it also speaks to a kind of exceptionalism in this. So there's kind of an exceptional solution, and yet the kind of hundreds, if not thousands of others that we know about and we don't know about, this practice has occurred, what happens to them? Some of these cases have been filed with the Integrity Commission to essentially solve the problem, proving who did this and how and why and whether these the sales of lands were legitimate or not is a long and convoluted process. And to the question of who the perpetrators are, I think I speak to that a little bit, but without getting into and attempting to identify specific groups that were involved, the kind of known entities of armed groups and factions, most of which are tied to the state, and some of the most influential are tied to al-Hashr al-Sha'bi. He basically legalized a conglomeration of armed factions, legalized and formerly part of the Iraqi state in 2016. Many of those groups implicated in these thefts and crimes are part of that institution. I don't think I'm saying anything too, maybe saying something controversial, but nothing unknown on some level. Thank you again for this.
Thank you, Omar. Sarah, would you like to answer Ahmed?
Sure thing. Really interesting question about the private sector and local government. I mean, just to build up on what Mona was saying about these states being very present, I also want to say that they're very savvy. There's something really interesting about the way in which sort of mechanisms of accumulation, and this brings us to this question of government and private sector, are, we've talked a lot about public-private partnerships, but what I found interesting, for example, in Turkey, is that the state poses as corporations. So you'll find that like a planning corporation, development corporation, and then you look into it and it turns out this is a 99% owned by the state. And you ask yourself, like, why did the state have to go through the trouble of setting itself up as a corporation in order to produce work that it's also doing through other agencies, right? So what is kind of that, why the need for the architecture of the private sector in the making of the state, I think is an interesting question that we're starting to see, or we've been seeing for a while. And the kind of the flip point of that, though, is what I found in my research is that we should be very careful, right? One, the state, and I think this is not new to anybody, all sorts of agencies, right? And they themselves have all sorts of political projects going on. And they don't line up very well, and they produce really interesting contestation in the city, within the state. So that's something that we should be thinking of. But also when we talk about kind of quote unquote kind of dispossessive projects, the way in which all of these organizations, international organizations, statal organizations, private sector corporations, almost working in tandem to produce a particular project, what someone like Julia Eliashar, whose work, by the way, is a total inspiration, but on this point, kind of calling it a field of power, I want to disagree, right? Because there's that is actually in investigating the fissures in these relationships that we're seeing a lot of political projects that we didn't expect operating. And so I would say kind of, yes, of course, there's quite a bit of collusion between these groups, but there's also a lot of tension and a lot of ways in which these groups are maneuvering around each other that produces really interesting politics.
And it's inside these intra-elite politics specifically where things can shift drastically. Lebanon is a case in point to observe that, among others, I'm sure, but it's a very important observation. I fully agree, Sarah. Rafif, would you like to answer Layla?
Sure. So the question is around whether there's a continuum with the humanitarian industry, I would say. And I think here, I've been playing around with this concept of logistical humanitarianism, I think first we need to remember that the term logistics first starts off in the military, moves on to the business world, and is then inherited in the humanitarian sector. So these are very much business practices that get extremely deepened within the war in Iraq, of course, as a theater of experimentation with the bunker.
I need you to repeat that. So they start where? In the business or the military?
In the military sector, yeah. So the container was very much created for the war in Vietnam in order to move supplies quicker to the front line. It then goes to civilian use. So it very much grows from military to business. The work of Professor Deborah Cowan kind of traces this in her book, The Life of Logistics. So seeing that, it has been the most deepened within our region to the point where now humanitarianism is organized as a business of logistics. This also means that people who are supplying the aid are very much distant from the people receiving the aid. And there's a sense that recipients of aid are treated as customers with customer service surveys, etc. So I think there's a critique here to be made of logistical humanitarianism altogether. And Dubai Humanitarian City is kind of like the epicenter of how do you turn humanitarianism into a business. I should add that for a very long time, it was Princess Haya that was in charge of Dubai Humanitarian City, or was the face of Dubai Humanitarian City. So there's all kinds of connections to branding and state branding as well. I have a longer article about this in Antipode from a few years ago if people are interested. It's called Circulating Power. But I think generally we should think of the humanitarian industry in a much more regional and trans-regional perspective, which populations get contained in places like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, versus which ones are then doing the provision of aid at a distance through so-called logistics chains.
Amazing, important questions. I invite a lot of people to work on this because we know little about it, I think, especially in this part of the world. With that, we conclude before the Zoom link cuts. I was reminded that we don't have a lot of time. Thanks for Zoom for allowing us to meet, although we're in very different parts of the world. Thanks all for attending and for engaging. Thanks again to APSN, to Hala in the back, and whoever else is there as well for making this possible. يعطيكم العافية, and we look forward to continuing the conversation through other means, hopefully. Good evening, everyone. تصبحوا على خير.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.